Welcome to our live stream. I'm joined today by art prof teaching artist Deepti Menon. And today we are doing a crit clash on Christo and Jeanne Claude's outdoor public art installations. If you would like to grow as an artist and you can't afford an art class, we've got everything you need here at Art Prof: critiques, tutorials, and professional development. Let's talk about how Crit Clash works. We assign a point of view to our staff. I am arguing for Christo and Jeanne Claude, and Deepti is going to be arguing against them. Now, what we say in this video may not actually be what we believe about Christo and Jeanne Claude in real life. It might be, you don't know. I am up against a professional actress here, so, cut me some slack. And we will tell you guys in the Discord after the stream is over what our real life opinions are of their work. So Deepti, why don't you get people going in terms of who Christo and Jeanne Claude were and what their work was like?
So Christo and Jeanne Claude were a married couple. Christo recently passed away, and I believe Jeanne Claude passed away in 2009. Christo meaning he passed away, I think, a couple months ago. And they're public artists and environmental artists. They use nature and cities and public spaces to create really, really large scale monumental works that often take years and years of planning to execute. And a lot of their work has, like an interactive element to it, or it creates like a very big impact. I think the impact of their work, and also something to note is that their work is always, I believe, Clara, temporal. Like it is ephemeral. It is only there for a couple of weeks or something like that. But what about you? What do you know about Christo and Jeanne Claude?
Well, when Deepti said that the work takes years, we mean decades, because there is actually a piece that was installed, I believe, in 2005, and it's possible maybe some of you guys actually got to see this piece, but it was installed into Central Park, and it was called The Gates. An example of how long these projects took to build. Christo actually had the sketch for The Gates in 1979. He tried to get it made in 1981, and it wasn't actually installed until 2005. So these are really long-term major projects, and they're extremely complicated to put together. I mean, just picture putting anything in Central Park, all the permissions, the logistics, the engineers. It's huge, monumental artworks that are very tough to pull off. He's wrapped buildings like the Reichstag in Berlin, the Pont Neuf in Paris. There was an umbrella installation in Japan, in the US. His work is international. It's pretty much all over the place. And in general, critics have been sort of on the fence about his work, but I think it's undeniable that his work is seen by millions of people. Extremely high visibility, very accessible artwork that's in the public for everybody to see and to really experience. A lot of cases in a lot of these pieces, people are walking on the project or into the project or next to the project. So it's a really interactive experience. So Deepti, let's get started with your opening argument against Christo.
My opening argument against Christo would happen to be the environmental impact of Christo and Jeanne Claude's work. I don't think that although there is a lot of planning and interaction happening with the government and local, whatever it takes to execute these projects, I feel like the impact that these projects are having are not saying a lot. And to call yourself an environmental artist or to work in this format and not really care about how it affects the surroundings, like in, some of these more metropolitan areas, perhaps covering up a building doesn't have the same impact. But in a couple of the rural areas that he works in, it is undeniable that this work is having a really strong environmental impact that isn't really being thought about. Even the building, but like over here, it's all home to animals, birds. It's really disrupting the landscape, I think, in a way that in all of my reading, I couldn't see either of the artists address that, or what was taken into account to think about that. And also, all of these materials are like plasticky, tarpy fabrics. And if you're working in the environment, maybe use organic materials. It doesn't seem like they care about, I mean, I've read that it's recycled afterwards, but what does that really mean? There's so many square feet of fabric just being used. And then what? But Clara, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, he's not the first artist. Well, Christo and Jeanne-Claude, they are not the first pair of artists to create giant monumental artworks that are not good for the environment. That's not to say, oh, that excuses it. Oh, everybody else is doing it. It's fine. But that's just anytime you build anything, that's going to be the case. I mean, think about architecture. In architecture, they build buildings, they wreck them. That's a big waste. I mean, we don't say, oh, architecture is not necessary, so we shouldn't bother building it. It's the same way. I mean, buildings come down all the time. Same thing with these art installations. And let's face it, most artwork is not that environmentally good to begin with. There's a lot of toxic supplies, oil paintings, acrylic paint. I think that just comes with the territory of being an artist.
I don't. I think that, sure, if you're a painter and you have a studio and you're working in a space and you're not thrusting your work into a natural space, like, for example, this one is in Colorado in the middle of this valley, and you're putting this really giant tarp-like structure there. I mean, how is that affecting birds that might fly through that valley? Where does that plastic go? And, you know, if you're going to be an environmental artist, I think you have to think about all of this stuff and not just make work because it looks cool and it has an impact. And I don't know, it feels wrong to me. And I also wonder, like, I couldn't find in any of my research conversations that he had with locals. Like, it said a lot of thing about like government and getting permissions and getting permits and self-funding things. But, you know, when you're working in these really rural, urban or rural areas, you know, that land is often home to people as well. What did they think about you coming in and stringing this orange tarp there? It feels wrong. And I do think that we have a responsibility. Or if you're if you're trying to make an impact with your work, I think just creating something that costs millions and millions of dollars and being like, well, it makes an impact because people look at it is not enough. You know, if you're using the landscape, maybe try and make some sort of commentary about why you're doing that.
But see, here's the thing. If Christo's installations were permanent, let's say that piece that we just saw that was in the Colorado area, and it was there forever, I could see that argument, because yes, that would definitely be very invasive to the environment. But the thing is, I think there's a reason why all his pieces are temporary. It's so that you can make it, experience it, and then long term, it does not devastate that whole space. So that temporary part of his work, I think, is very important to note. We have a comment from Chain of Thorns. They are saying, my mom works for the Forest Service and has to write environmental impact statements, which are required for any installation of this size. And a lot of artists don't think of the impact of their work, and it's really difficult to work with them and make sure they clean up afterwards. Response to that, Deepti?
I mean, it makes sense. I think that a lot of times artists see environments as, oh, this would be really cool, or this would be really awesome to have it here. But really, what is the impact? And to your like temporal thing, Clara, I think that like you could punch someone in the face and that could last a week, the bruising, but I think the impact of that could last a lifetime. And I feel like this has a similar effect. Sure, it's gone, but is the impact really gone? How has it, affected this environment and, with architecture, sure, buildings come up and down, but what is the intent? That is, to house someone or to create. There is an intent behind most architectural spaces. But with this, it's almost just like, cool, I did, like, look at this thing that I did, guys, cool. And what else? I don't really see any other what else after that. Do you?
Well, see, Deepti, I don't think it's that simple, because his art brings the artwork to the world, okay? Because most of the art world is actually not that accessible. If you just even think about museums, okay? Supposedly museums are there for people to experience the art, but look at the price tag of going to a museum. I mean, I don't go to the museum because for me, a family of 4 can cost over $100 only to have my kids complain after 20 minutes that they want to leave. So for a lot of people, museums are not accessible, okay? But take this piece, which is a piece that Christo and Jeanne-Claude made in Italy, actually not that long ago, in 2016. Look at how many people are experiencing this. People who are actually literally on the artwork. I mean, there are not that many artworks that are on this grand of a scale that engage this many people. There has to be something said about that.
Definitely. I think it is bringing clearly tons and tons of people, but it almost reminds me of just like an Instagrammable experience. Like, again, I'm like, what are these people getting out of walking on this that they couldn't get out of walking on a bridge? You know, it feels like there's not a lot of thought put into it. And, you know, I will say, like, yes, this is a huge feat. Like we talked about earlier, the time, the amount of work that goes into it. But when you're walking on this work, are you really aware of the process it took to create this, the amount of labor that went into it? It almost seems like all of this money and all of this work went into creating an experience that was for what? What did you gain? And sure, it is accessible, but is that benefit worth the cost of maybe the lasting effects it has on this aquatic environment it's in, and you know, the surrounding environment that it is in as a whole?
I look at this work and it is awe-inspiring. And I think there are not that many things in the world that make you feel that way, where there doesn't have to be a reason why it's there. Like you say to yourself, okay, a pair of shoes, I have to wear shoes if I'm going outside. It's totally utilitarian. Not everything on the planet has to have a totally utilitarian purpose. Like, for example, Madeline is saying, what's the reason for this sort of work? I don't really understand what they're trying to say. But that's the thing, is Christo and Jeanne-Claude's work, it's like this phenomenon that you don't need to have a reason. Like, you don't have to say, oh, I need vitamin D, so I'm going to eat that. Like, that just takes the whole mystique out of it. Like you said, oh, it's just like walking on a bridge. It's not. I mean, look at the way they're walking. They're like floating on water. It's this trail of people. They're not trying to go from Boston to New York. They're just in the moment.
Sure, they are in the moment. It is, you know, a very cool experience. I will say that. But what, you know, when you have, I think this specific piece cost $17 million to create. When you have $17 million to create an experience, why not say something with that experience? I mean, he died as an old man. He was 80 something years old, I think. And when you're working for decades and decades of your life, what are you really saying with these pieces other than I created an experience for someone to walk on a really, you know, if this was a different color, would it have the same I don't know. I feel like it just feels like he picked a really bright color, took the fact that he's very wealthy and can pull these things off because he has $17 million, and just used what was there. And also for this piece, I remember reading, he said he tried to make it in Japan and he tried to make it somewhere else, and he landed up in Italy because he said, if things don't happen our way, we don't do the project. And I feel like if you're going to work in this environmental way, maybe being flexible and using the environment and using what the community asks for is part of the process. If you're going to emphasize the process so much and, you know, the impact it has and the fact that it's accessible and stuff, you're not really taking into consideration the local community and the people who are actually there and have to stare at this thing or make this thing all the time. You know what I'm saying?
Here's the thing though, Deepti, artists have a vision, and we can't just go into a project and just bend over backwards to everybody's will. If that were the case, we would not have any artistic voice. And so, sure, when you're working in an environment like something like this, yes, you have to consider the land and the water and the logistics of actually putting that together. But I think what's extraordinary is that Christo and Jeanne-Claude never backed down. They had a vision, and they were so powerful in trying to execute that they never compromised their vision. And I respect that as an artist, because you don't want to just bend over to everybody's demand.
But did they have a vision? Because they originally wanted to do this in Japan, and then they tried another location. And I feel like everything is so site specific but they have no, like, but they're just like, okay, fine. Well, if Japan doesn't want me to do it the way that I want to do it, I'm going to pick. Like, it feels like they are actually very flexible, because if they don't get things the way they want, they go somewhere else. So why couldn't you be flexible in a way that is nurturing and catering towards the community that is asking for this?
Soy Tainli says, if something like this was done once for effect, it would make a statement. But to do it over and over just seems like a waste. I'm going to give you some thoughts about that. My feeling is that artists have always worked their whole lives, unless, and even artists who had physical issues later in life still kept producing. So I don't think it's fair to get on Christo and Jeanne-Claude for continually creating work, because that is very typical. Now, I do think that there is such a thing as an artist who's just doing the same thing over and over again, but that is not the case. I mean, look at this piece, Surrounded Islands. It's so vastly different in shape than, say, this piece, which is this umbrella installation that he made. I think their work is incredibly diverse. I think that they reacted to the landscape in a lot of different ways.
I do think it is diverse. There's definitely a lot of diversity in color, choice, shape, but are they reacting to the landscape, or are they just putting things in places? I don't really understand when I look at these umbrellas, and from an artist statement, what I've read, I don't really understand the impact that these umbrellas are making, other than the fact that it's like a high contrast with the dry landscape. But, you know, even the bases that the umbrellas are on, I feel like that could be thought out better. How could it have interacted with the ground better? It just looks like a plank of something. You know, it doesn't, it's honestly kind of an ugly, just rectangular shape on top of this. Could that have also been yellow? That might have, you know, made an impact. It just feels like everything, they just have an idea, but they don't really spend time, which is hard to believe because it takes so much time. But it feels like they have an idea and they don't really spend time thinking about, like, what does this mean? Why am I doing it? And I've tried doing the research and looking at it. I mean, Clara, do you know what the purpose of this umbrella installation was?
I mean, I don't think art always has to have a purpose, right? I think that art exists for different reasons. Like, think about something like Gothic cathedrals, okay? Those were made in the Middle Ages with, like, hammers. I mean, people had no technology, and they took literally 100 years to build. There was no really functional reason. Churches did not have to be like that. And yet, to me, it speaks to the human condition that we want to create things that don't always have to be so utilitarian. And I don't think it's fair for you to get on them for basic structural elements like the base. I mean, chances are there was some engineering issue that made it so it had to be that way. Come on, you don't think about installations for decades and not think that through. I think a lot of it has to do with just the construction of it. You can't always make whatever you want. You have to make sure it doesn't fall over in the middle of the installation.
Well, Clara, did you know actually that this specific piece, 2 people died because of this umbrella piece? One was a spectator who an umbrella blew over and pinned her against a boulder and killed her. And the other was, after this happened, the artists very quickly told their, you know, team to take this installation down. And one of these umbrella installations was in Japan, and one of the Japanese workers got electrocuted while taking these pieces down. So in fact, for the first death, which is the woman who was a spectator, I think that would go to show that perhaps it really wasn't thought through that well.
All right, you got me. That's terrible. It's terrible if your artwork kills people. That's really terrible. I have no argument against that. But I am going to talk about the way Christo and Jeanne-Claude defied genres, because people are very quick to want to categorize artwork. This is an installation. This is architecture. This is a painting. This is sculpture. And there's some artworks that are easier to categorize than others. But the thing is, you cannot categorize Christo and Jeanne-Claude. They really created their own genre. Try to put them into the world of sculpture. Doesn't really fit. Installation, not really. It's not architectural either. And yet it interacts with architecture. How many artists do you know really created their own genre?
I feel like they've created their own genre because they don't do enough in any genre. They're just kind of scratching the surface with all of these kind of half thought out thoughts that are, I mean, truly what I'm trying to say is I feel like I look at this work and it feels like if I gave a kid that I babysat $17 million and was like, like do something, and they do it small scale, and we're like, okay, cool, now you have $17 million. Let's do it big. Like, and even in all of his writings, it doesn't feel like he has a lot to say about the pieces other than, it had an impact. I thought it was cool. And that's how I feel about like the fact that they can't categorize, they don't fall into any specific category. It doesn't feel like they're really giving thought and spending time and growing as artists in a specific category. They're just kind of like, oh, and then this bridge, and then Central Park. And like, it feels scattered to me. And that doesn't seem like a good thing in my head.
But see, Deepti, I think the ability to think on such a monumental scale is extraordinary. Okay, I think that your average artist, even somebody who has a lot of experience, just the thought of, I think I'm going to make this, fine, you can have that idea. But to actually carry it out and to follow through on all those logistics is really extraordinary. And I have to say, I respect Christo and Jeanne-Claude for that, because there are so many artists who have great ideas, that's fine. But how many of them really follow through in this way? I think that this is a process that most people would think about for 2 seconds and then run away. But Christo and Jeanne-Claude, they had a vision and they held onto it, and they actually made it happen. Lying Down says, I thought the intricacy and beauty of Gothic cathedrals was a way to bring the public closer to God, quote, visually, when literacy was much lower back then. Absolutely. I mean, a Gothic cathedral is not the same thing as a Christo installation or artwork. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that they didn't have to make buildings that took 200 years to build. Same thing with this. Nobody has to make monumental artwork. And yet, to me, this says something about the time period. And these are unforgettable pieces. You can't look at them and not be impacted somehow. So, Deepti, let's talk a little bit about the logistics, the engineers, the permissions. How can you not be impressed by that?
Because I'm not impressed by the outcome of all of these people's work. I feel bad for them. I feel bad that they spent so much time and energy making something that just is there for an impact and to look cool. And I actually do think that creating work that requires so many people and so many members of a community is actually very, very impressive. But nothing about the final piece really applauds them. That could be a really interesting way of making this piece more impactful, is to shine more of a light on the process and the people, but it feels very much like Jeanne-Claude and Christo made this piece. And of course, a lot of other people were a part of it, but who were these people? Were they members of the community? Were they brought in from, their Belgian and French? I don't know anything that went, who were these people? And I'm truly just trying to find ways for the artists to make their work, have more meaning and sit with me and last in my heart for a little bit longer. Like, I think the piece that impacts me most is the umbrellas, because I feel so disheartened and hurt and sad for the people that died. I mean, that's truly awful. What an awful, awful thing. So, I was thinking, I was just like, wow, it would be really incredible if when you walked up to this fence, for example, you could see like the stitching or something that really showed us that there were hundreds of people involved in making this, like just something, but it feels so almost like factory sterile that I don't see the hand in the work. Go ahead.
Here's the thing, though, Deepti. There are so many contemporary artists who don't have their physical hand in the work. Tara Donovan, who makes those huge installations, it is not uncommon for a lot of artists to do that. And I think typically the people that make those installations, it's just a given that they're not going to get credit. It's different than a movie where you have the end credits and you see like every single person that worked on it. That's just sort of the system that the art world has really set up. But I think you're judging it way too much just on the photos, because Deepti, have you ever seen one of these in real life?
No, have you?
No. But I will say, and I think you guys can tell us in the chat, different experiences you've had. Sometimes I look at an artwork in a photo and I think, whoa, that looks really cool. And then you go see it, you're like, this sort of sucks. And sometimes it's the other way around. You see the photo, you think, it's not that great. And then you see it, it's like, oh my God, the heavens are opening up and I'm being influenced. So it's tricky because you and I don't have physical experience to speak from. But I'm just saying, you don't know. Maybe you can see the stitching up close, Deepti.
Maybe you can. It just doesn't seem like like the intent was there to show that. It doesn't seem like the artist cared to show that. And I'm not saying, I think what you say is right, Clara. A lot of artists do have assistants and a lot of people helping them. And I don't think those people expect to be involved in the final product. I was just thinking, from the perspective of Jeanne-Claude and Christo, their work has expanded over decades. And I feel like throughout those decades, they look different and there's different shapes and colors and ways of working. But at the end, with each piece, I'm just left being like, okay, but why? And one of the ways for why I could think is a common theme throughout all of their pieces is the labor and intensity and years it takes to create these works. And that's something that's really interesting and unique and a common theme. And I think they could show that somehow through their works, but I don't see that at all.
Menon says, simple methods allow us to discover new ways of thinking and speculative exploration to discover a new form. Well, I'm glad that you brought that up because one of the things that Christo and Jeanne-Claude do together is that they break down something which is so immense, like, for example, the Reichstag in Berlin, and simplifies it into something that feels so honest and true. It's like he's getting to the essence of that form. And that's incredible because the Reichstag is huge. And it's really hard to think about distilling a piece of architecture. That concept of being able to look at the world on such a grand scale in such a simple way, that's an amazing balance of ideas.
I agree, but I'm curious, how would the architects who created this building feel about it just being draped like this and distilled down? It's hard for me to imagine a building of this grand scale not actually being thought of as an artwork itself and being thought of an artwork that should be experienced on the inside as well as the outside. And it seems like these artists are just wrapping it and distilling it down to these simple forms without really considering its original intent.
But see, if I was the architect, let's say I designed the Reichstag, okay? Now, if Christo came in and was like, I'm going to alter all this and it was permanent, yes, I would be mad about that. And that does happen sometimes with architecture, that architects are hired to add to pre-existing structures and people get mad about that. That's common. But the thing is, his is temporary. And the way I see it, Christo is having an artistic conversation with that architect. He didn't just take the stuff and just drape it on top. I mean, this is thought through. You look at the areas of tension where he's emphasizing the form of the architecture. This really is an artist talking to another artist, but in completely different genres. That's phenomenal. How many people do you know have conversations like this on such a grand scale?
Not a lot. But then I would also argue that I think the wrapping then could be better. If you really are distilling it down to simple shapes, I really want to see those shapes. And I don't think the wrapping is as tight and as crisp and really revealing its form as well as it could be. Like, where are I bet you anything there are windows and doors, and that's all part of the simple forms of this architecture. And I don't really see that in those pieces. So
windows and doors are cosmetic, Deepti. You have to see past the surface and look at the deep internal structure of the Reichstag. And that is what Christo is after. For example, Seven Angelic is saying the wrapping of the building does show off its shape. And Mario says the hundreds of people and thousands of work hours that help make each of these artists possible was always extensively documented and shared by both artists, way beyond what others ever did. Well, thank you, Mario. I think we need to start talking about that. His work is sorry, I keep mentioning Christo. It's because when I took art history, they always called him Christo, and now it's Christo and Jeanne-Claude. So I'm just like very confused. But the point is that the work is more than the installation. It lives on through the documentation, through the sketches, the experience. And tell us in the chat, has anybody here actually seen a Christo piece in real life? I'd be very curious if somebody could share their experience. But that's the thing, you're focusing too much on just the piece, but the piece is bigger than that.
I suppose, but then why use this material? I'm curious, I'm curious for there to be more thought. If you're trying to show form, what can you show through the choice of material? Like that material does not seem like the best material used to show the form of that architectural space. The fact that it's white, the contrast is not that high. It could prove to have higher contrast to show the shape more in the scope of the entire landscape. Like I think that there could be a little bit more thought and intent put into something as simple as showing form of a complex architectural building.
Katie Riley is saying, in terms of the wrapping, it's completely relying on the building itself. Using the aesthetic currency of an already created piece does not make the new piece novel. Well, let's talk about that, because I think building upon something else, you want to have remnants of that original piece visible. That's what makes it a conversation. Because if Christo just put like a big dome over the Reichstag, that's not a conversation. That's just covering up. But like, look at this piece. In Valley Curtain, he's really accentuating the contour of a valley. And that is beautiful. Such a huge, grand space. And he distills it down to this very simple arc. I mean, that's really tremendous. Most people look at this, they go, oh, trees and bushes and whatever. But he's thinking so much bigger than that.
I suppose you could say that. Honestly, that's not my reading when I look at it. It just feels like a tarp that's being hung. And the fact that it, scallops at each place that it's pinned feels like if it really wanted to show this like nice curve that it had, my eyes go to this scallop, which doesn't really show the curve, and the folds down there. It doesn't really, my eye doesn't go to the overall like curve at the bottom. So sure, I can take your argument for that, but I don't agree.
Josh is asking, what other material do we even want, Deepti?
Well, I don't know what material is there to begin with, but I feel like it is, first of all, a plasticky material, which I have read in the past, which is wasteful, like I've said in the past. But I think it could be like a stretchier, more slick, almost like elastic material, similar to, like an elastic, or like what's on a trampoline, like something that has a nice elastic shape to it, so it can really stick to the form and show us, like I was saying, all the little cracks, the windows, the doors. This just feels like a tarp that was, 3 little cinches put around to show its space, but it still feels balloony. And Josh is also asking with the contrast, and I was, going to say that the high contrast is there in the whites, yes, with the light hitting it, but from the photographs, again, I haven't seen it in person, but I feel like from the photographs, it's trying to show the entire building in the scope of the city. And with the city, he's used in other works of his with these hot pinks and magentas and the oranges to create a really interesting contrast with the landscape. I think in this piece, especially to show form and an outline of a building in the scope of an entire city, you could choose something that's not white, because all of the similar buildings are like a gray tone. Something like this red color could really show that outline from an aerial perspective.
Well, I think another thing to consider too is we've been focusing a lot on just the object that Christo and Jeanne-Claude built. But the thing is, if you look at some of these photos, I mean, Christo and Jeanne-Claude, you guys had a good photographer. Wolfgang Waltz was their primary photographer. He shot most of the photos of their artwork. The artwork really does have an impact on everything else. Like, for example, this is a piece you can see here. It's in water. But the thing is, you have this incredible reflective surface. And so the artwork, I think, in a lot of ways, reaches well beyond that. And there's another piece, I'm going to try to find it, of the Pont Neuf in Paris. And if you guys look at this, there's this gorgeous abstraction that starts to happen where the folds come down and they crisscross. So it's more than just the physical building. It's also the effect of that building on the water, on the sky. That's quite an incredible phenomenon that you can't achieve on a small scale.
I would argue that maybe you can achieve that on a smaller scale. And like, I do also think that the bridge is already doing that with the water and with the sky. And that piece of architecture or that monument that he's covering is already doing that. What is the artist doing that's new? It's adding a color and a different material to it. But I think that these objects are already, doing that with these environmental elements it's existing in. But I don't see this as being a really, new, awesome thing that he's, a new, awesome relationship that he's creating. It is very beautiful and cool, but I'm kind of wondering what more, what else for millions and millions of dollars.
Because the Pont Neuf is a bridge that has been there for ever and ever and ever. And then you get used to it. You know what to expect. Christo and Jeanne-Claude come in and they shake up that familiarity of that space. And all of a sudden, people will see that sky and that water with a new pair of eyes. And that's quite remarkable. Not a lot of people can take something that people are accustomed to and make them see it in a different light. So I think that as somebody, if I lived in that neighborhood, that would be such an event to see something that I know so well transformed into something else. All right, guys, it is time for you to figure out who you think won this crit clash. And by the way, speaking of big installations that cost lots of money and use tons of materials, I think you guys might like to look at this crit clash from Tara Donovan. And this other one about Yayoi Kusama, who did those pumpkins, and her work is all over the place right now. So if you guys want related crit clashes, we have those. But tell us in the chat, who won? Was it me arguing for Christo and Jeanne-Claude? Was it Deepti arguing against them? And so while you guys deliberate that, we're going to show you guys an Art Prof share. This Art Prof share is from Vivian Smith, and it's actually from a tutorial on animation that Deepti led. So this is perfect that you're on the stream to talk about this Art Prof share. So Vivian talks about doing Deepti's stop motion animation tutorial. We're basically, well, why don't you explain it, Deepti? It's your tutorial.
Yeah, so I did this tutorial on doing a stop motion animation on a strange object, and I was curious with like wasted food at grocery stores that often get thrown out that have like issues with it or something. So I started off in the fall, this was years ago, with a gourd, and then when I did the tutorial, we did it with this kind of like rotten, gross eggplant, and I used a sphere, a spherical shape, and just created basically an animation with something that you have on hand, and you create each frame on the same surface, so you don't have a light box to refer to for the previous frame. You're kind of using just your eye, and then I use a really simple app on an iPhone to photograph it, and then it kind of lives as a artwork digitally, and as a gourd that gets thrown out, or an eggplant that was going to go in the trash, it's now can be an artwork for a little while.
I mean, I think what's so cool about this tutorial is that actually you end up with two artworks, because I'm showing you guys right now, this is Vivian's animation, which is, of course, the main part of the piece. But the thing is, if you guys go back, I love the pumpkin just as an object in itself. I think it's really compelling in this idea that you have a film on an object is just so cool. So Vivian says in their statement that the great thing about drawing on a vegetable is that it kept each frame in order. It was easy to shift the vegetable to the next frame when recording the animation. And so Vivian says that they improvised with chalkboard markers and it worked out great. So how do you think Vivian did, Deepti?
I think this is awesome. I also love the idea of drawing a pumpkin on top of a pumpkin. I think it's so fun to use a pumpkin in the fall, which is what I had originally did, because it's, using something you might already have, but it's really fun. The movement is really great. I love the fact that it appears out of a simple dot and then disappears into this blackness. It has a really nice transition in and out of the animation. And I agree, the contrast in the final piece, I think it'll exist really beautifully in your house or wherever you decide to put it.
You know what else is super cool? Vivian really killed two birds with one stone, because actually they did the piece in response to your tutorial, but it also has to do with the October Art Dare, which has a different word every single day. So Vivian actually did the words roll and night. So cool. I think that Vivian ended up doing that. It's such a great piece. So take a look at this tutorial if you guys have a chance. It's a really cool one. And if any of you guys would like to submit your artwork that you created in response to one of our videos, you want to get a YouTube shout out here on one of our videos, just go to tutorials and project ideas, click on the purple button, and that will take you to the Art Prof Share submission form. Or if you guys want to just tag us on Instagram and use hashtag #ArtProfShare, we love seeing what you guys are doing. All right, Deepti, it's time to do some counting. Let's see what's going on. But actually, before I do that, I just want to say that Cerulean Vivian is here in the chat. So very cool. Cerulean saying, that's me. Thanks, Deepti, for such an awesome animation tutorial. Very cool. Well, Deepti, it's a little bit split. Blue Wolf Spirit thinks that you crushed it. Ashley thinks I kept my head above water. Well, thank you very much. And Jing Jing says, I don't really like artwork that causes people to die. So, Deepti, seems like the death thing is sort of getting in the way. Actually, you guys want to hear a little secret? I told Deepti about that little fact.
She did. She did. As we said, guys, these crit clashes were assigned sides. So you never know who gives other people what information. At the end of the day, we're all on the same team, Clara and I.
Chamang says, the conceptual idea of looking at a new form from an exciting space, you for Christo and Jeanne Claude. And Soy Tainley says, I wouldn't say anyone wins. It's very controversial work. Lots of good points were made pro and con. And Josh is saying, have to vote for Clara. I agree, Deepti debated well, but I think she completely misrepresented how much Christo and Jeanne Claude do research the environmental impacts of their work. I mean, we would have to look that up. Like, I honestly don't know. I have not done enough research to be able to speak with authority on that, but maybe that's something for you guys to look into. Ashley says, Professor Lieu held her own, but Deepti took it home with the information about the people who died. I guess this is the way to win a crit clash, you guys, which is to find an artwork. Yeah, like Seven Angelic says, the death thing was the nail in the coffin. Oh dear, Deepti, I think you got it, because oh man, this is so I have to say this was a losing.
You got a lot of votes though, Clara. I think it might even be.
I don't know. It seems like you won, but people were like, Clara held her head above water, so that's enough.
You did. You did a great job. But you know what? I was going to say, it is a really interesting point to note, like, the research, because a lot of times with the debate, you know, I did do research and stuff, but like, you can't expect people who are debating pro and con, or at least on this Art Prof platform where we do streams every night, to be the most educated. So sometimes our views are coming from just how, you know, an artist like you and me would interact with this piece just by looking at it on the internet, or researching it for an hour or 2 hours, or knowing from of it, like you said, from when you were in school. So, you know, there's a lot more that can be argued and thought about after doing a lot of research.
Yeah, I mean, research is definitely something that you can get on people for. And according to the YouTube comments, some people are a little peeved that we don't do more research. But my feeling is that everybody on the planet has a different degree of information. Some people are like, historians on Christo. Other people are like, who's that? And so I don't think you always need to do research to be able to give your take on. In fact, sometimes it's better to have a cold read. Some of you guys in the Discord know, you just want to know, is it coming across or not? Art Prof has a podcast. It's available on Spotify and also on iTunes. If you guys want to know what we think in real life about Christo and Jeanne Claude, join us in the Art Prof Discord. By the way, it should say Crit Clash Reveals channel. Sorry, that's a mistake. Crit Clash Reveals is where we're going to be hanging out in a few minutes. The invite link is in the video description below. please subscribe to our channel and join the Art Prof family. And thank you to our top Patreon supporters for giving us the help that we need to keep Art Prof up and running and free and accessible to everybody. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.